Thanks, Greg, and thank you for shaving your mustache. You really can only have one person with a mustache on stage per week. Otherwise, it just gets to be too much. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this event. So good to see all of your faces. For those of you who are in person, for those of you who are watching online, want to say hi. If you're watching in the future, I've been praying today that in the name of Jesus, you would be blessed as you study the Word of God. And I hope that you are, and I believe that you will be. We are looking at the book of Exodus. Turn to your neighbor and say, Exodus. It means exit. That's what it means. It's like a big exit sign, because when we left the people of Israel in the end of Genesis, where were they? They were in Egypt, and then what happens is it moves on from there, and it does not go super great. Then it totally does. We're looking at the first section of the Bible. I call it God's law. That's what a lot of people call it. And then it moves on from there through all of these different sections. If you're newer to the Bible, this is a great little tool for you. And then in God's law, we looked at Genesis last week. That's about God's people. Now we're going to look at Exodus, God's people's exit. God's people's exit. The book of Exodus is structured like this. And let me just quickly read through the outline. Then we're going to go through the whole outline. And I'm going to give you tips and tricks for understanding this book. This is a really, really good book. And hidden in it is one of my absolute favorite things about God that I've ever learned. And it was a long time before I saw it randomly in the text. So I'm going to share that with you tonight. Exodus basically tells the origin of Moses, who's the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible. These were written around 1400 BC, and it tells of their journey, the people of Israel, out of Egypt to the base of Mount Sinai, where the rest of the Pentateuch is going to take place. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all written at the base of this mountain. They all take place at the base of this mountain, and that's where we're going to be going to today. So why don't we start by looking at the origin of Moses. Origin of Moses. I've seen a lot more people naming their kids Moses lately. I got to tell you, I'm a fan. It might be a lot to live up to, but here we are. Israel is the name of the grandson of Abraham. It's been changed to Israel in Genesis. Israel is now becoming a people group just like what God said to Abraham. And now the beginning of Exodus tells us that unfortunately it kind of like flips. And it says that there's a brand new Pharaoh in Egypt, and he does not like how big the people of Israel are growing. Not only does he not like them, but it says that, quote, he did not know Joseph. So a lot of the goodwill that Joseph has brought to the table is now gone. And so what we see here is we see Israel's in slavery. The Pharaoh is insecure of how powerful Israel is becoming. Why is that mentioned? Because what God said to Abraham is happening. That's the whole point. They are multiplying much faster than you would ever expect as a people group. Pharaoh decides that he's going to say to kill all of the Jewish males 2 years of age and under. And a bunch of the people of Israel are like, we're not doing that. We're not killing our babies. These guys are lit, right? And so anyways, Moses' mom has Moses, and it says that she disobeys. So she hides him at their house, which I don't know how much you know about babies. Hiding a baby is incredibly hard during the time that they are crying and will not stop crying. I was at a funeral here on Saturday, and this sweet little kid could not stop like yelling, and their poor parents were trying so hard to get them to be quiet. And that kid was like 2 or 3 years old. So you just cannot tell a kid to stop crying. And so she does a good job of that. And then she ends up, you guys know the story, right? She makes this basket, covers it, puts Moses in the basket, lets him go in the river. Just like iconic, like, I can't figure this out, but there's no chance I'm letting anyone hurt my baby. So Moses kind of like floating around. It's kind of like the very first water ride that the world had ever seen. He's kind of floating around. He ends up with Pharaoh's daughter. And it's really incredible because what you see is you see the providence of God, because She picks up this baby. She's like, oh my gosh, this is a baby. That's how he gets the name Moses. That's what Moses means. It means drawn out of the water, lifted up out of the water. And then she is like, I wanna have this kid as a son, but I don't wanna do anything, right? Just like classic rich people problems. And she ends up sending Moses to Moses' mother to raise her. This is what happens when you, as a Christian, say, you know what, I'm not gonna obey the way of the world. Sometimes God does a miracle and brings you the thing you desired most. So we see all of these things. If you wanna understand the life of Moses, it's really just 3 sets of 40 is the easiest way to understand the life of Moses. Moses was in Egypt for about 40 years. He was in Midian at the base of Mount Sinai for about 40 years. And then he was about 40 years leading Israel. And so that's a really easy way to do that. According to first century historian Josephus, who's like a total lower G God for everybody who studies the Bible, Moses was next in line to be the Pharaoh. It doesn't say that in the text, but it is a reliable historical tradition that Moses potentially was going to become the Pharaoh. And instead of that, God had a different plan. And we see in this early chapter where God is still saying, teaching the origins of Moses in chapters 1 through 6, we see what happens, which is that Moses kills an Egyptian. And if you've seen the movie Prince of Egypt, it kind of pitches it like it was an accident, but that's not what it says in the text. It says in the text that he looks left, looks right, and then he fights against this guy. Why? Because this guy is beating one of Moses's people, right? And Moses is like the space between, because he's like in power like an Egyptian, but he's a Jew. And so this is what happens. And then the next day someone finds out and he hears about it and he runs out into the wilderness and he ends up living in Midian. He ends up getting married. He ends up seeing the burning bush. You guys know this part, right? Here's my burning bush meme. And what we see in the text is really interesting. Moses becomes a farmer and he's basically just rejected all of his power. And he's like, I'm just gonna hang out here with my wife Zipporah and my son Gershom. I'm just gonna chill and like be a shepherd or something. And then he's walking past a cave. And you know what's crazy? The cave that he's walking past is at the base of Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai is the big mountain in the story of Moses and in the Pentateuch, and this is where he is. And he's walking past this cave and he hears this voice, and the voice, he looks, and this voice is coming from a bush that is on fire, but the bush is not burning up. And it's the voice of God. Now, why did God appear in a burning bush? Well, it's not just that it was burning. It's that it was burning but not burning up. That's the point. It isn't a bush that was on fire. It was a bush that was on fire but was not being consumed. What does that mean? It is showing something that God is about to say when he says his name. So Moses goes in, he takes off his sandals because God says, do that, you chump, it's holy ground. I don't want your gross shepherd sandals walking all over my hot, holy sand. And so Moses goes in, and it's this incredible, incredible exchange where God's like, hey, I've picked you, you're my guy. And Moses is like, okay, where am I going? And God tells him, poor Moses must have been thinking, anywhere but there. And any group of people but those people. Because he has to go back and face the thing that he has done, or at least that's what he's thinking. And so at the end of the whole thing, this amazing encounter, Moses says, so like, what's your name? Which is wild, because we've just gotten through Genesis where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph know God so personally. But God gives a new name to Moses. It's not a name that he had given in the book of Genesis. God says from the bush, my name is Yahweh, which means I am who I am, or I am that I am. Not I was, not I will be, the forever present tense God. And that's why he appeared in a burning bush, because that's what the bush is showing. Power perpetually, had no beginning, has no end. It's a bush that's on fire, but the bush is never gonna burn up. It is perpetual power forever. Does that make sense? And so that's what you see there in the text. And then we're gonna move into the second section. So then Moses says, I don't like talking. And so God sends him Aaron, who's his brother. And Moses and Aaron go back. It's kind of like a dynamic duo. And they're gonna confront the Pharaoh. And so then we move into this part that is 10 plagues and one Passover from chapters 7 to 13. So we see the 10 plagues, and then we see the institution of the Passover. There's a ton of stuff that's really interesting in this section. Number one is that God tells Moses that God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. But in the narrative, it goes back and forth between saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And what it's doing is it's teaching us something about the way that God works. God is, in his supernatural ability, causing Pharaoh to choose to harden his heart, but it does not violate the Pharaoh's own choice. And that's what we see when it alternates back and forth. Some people call that theological truth the divine human cooperative. Other people look at it in other ways, but that's a really interesting part that we see in the text. Another interesting part is that Moses and Aaron are kind of afraid because all they say to the Pharaoh the first time is like, we just want to go out into the wilderness for like 3 days. They know full well that's not what they're asking for, but they're too afraid to ask for the full thing that God actually asks them to ask for. So they're like, we just want a long weekend, bro. Did you ever hear of Labor Day? Like, come on, these bricks are not gonna build themselves out of straw. Then we see the 10 plagues, and the 10 plagues are really interesting for a variety of reasons, one of which is just amazing and very, very, very interesting. The other thing about the 10 plagues that's interesting is each one of them is specifically meant to show the power of Yahweh, the power of I am that I am, over the specific powers that the Egyptians believed that their gods had. And again, if you've seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, which I love that movie, but when it comes to the parts of the plagues, they take the wrong angle on what the Bible actually says. Because you know that in the story, you guys know the story, right? So in the story, God does all these miracles, but they're plagues on the Egyptian people. And then for the first few, Pharaoh's dark spiritual advisors are able to mimic them. And in the movie, The Prince of Egypt, if you've never seen it, it's a really good movie. But in the movie, they show these guys, these false priests, kind of fake making it, fake making water turn to blood, fake making frogs appear, but that's not what happens in the text. So what that's doing is actually minimizing the spirituality of what's going on. We have here a real spiritual battle between God, Yahweh, the forever present tense God, and the labeled demons of the people of Egypt. And so you see the Nile turned to blood. They believed in the Nile. They believed the Nile was a god. You see the plague of frogs, which is against another Egyptian goddess with a frog head. You see the plague of gnats, which is against the god Set, the god of the desert. You see the plague of flies, the death of livestock, of boils. These are all over specific gods of Egypt. And then you see plagues 7 through 9. And it's really interesting because when you read the narrative, you can see Pharaoh kind of loosening his grip a little bit. So first he's like, all right, go out to the desert and worship your God, but just the men or something. And then you can see it kind of this tug of war back and forth between what God told Moses and Aaron to say and what the Pharaoh is willing to allow. Then you see this plague of darkness, which is about the sun god Ra from Egypt. And then you see the final plague, which serves a duo purpose in the narrative. The final plague is the death of the firstborn, if you don't know the story. And the greatest god in Egypt was the Pharaoh. And so what happens is, it's a picture of Christ because the curse that comes upon the Egyptian people is a curse that God allowed to be put on Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And that's what the New Testament teaches. Secondarily, we see God again mercifully give the Egyptian people a way out. Everyone was able to paint the blood of the lamb on their doorpost. If you're unfamiliar with the story, the general idea is God's going to bring this last plague. It's going to be the worst one. Any house that doesn't have the blood of a lamb painted on its door is going to have the loss of the firstborn son in their house. But anyone could do it. So the Egyptian people were not doing it. And the people of Israel were all doing this thing, which ends up setting the place for the institution of this yearly holiday that God wants the Jewish people to celebrate. It's called Passover. And it's really interesting because it has bread that has not risen yet. Unleavened bread. Leaven is what makes bread rise. The reason it's unleavened bread is because Exodus, we got to go. God even tells them, hey, eat with your sandals on, right? We got to go. We're not relaxing. And then what happens is we see the exit of God's people. Because after this final plague, which serves all of those purposes, Pharaoh goes back and says the repeating phrase, which is, let my people go. Moses says to Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh is like, go. We also see that Passover, of course, is a clear picture of Jesus. So we're tracking the Jesus moments in the Old Testament. I'm not saying these are all of them. I'm just tracking the amount that we have talked about. So we talked about 4 Jesus moments last week in Genesis. And now we're talking about this Jesus moment number 5, which is the Passover. The New Testament makes clear repeatedly that Passover is pointing towards Jesus, and communion, or the Eucharist, is pointing back to Jesus. So for all of recorded, or much of recorded human history, what we have is we have a yearly tradition of taking Passover, which is a gigantic arrow pointing towards the cross of Jesus Christ. And then weekly at church, or quarterly or monthly, we have communion, the Eucharist, which is pointing back to Christ. So these things that God is instituting here have a significant purpose. That's the purpose of them. It is to point to Christ. And we do a Passover Seder. We did one last year. Who was here when we did the Passover Seder last year? Yeah, that was a lot of fun. You get to eat some parsley and stuff. And we'll probably do another one of those this year. That was a lot of fun. There was estimates were about 2 million people from Israel that left Egypt. And God said, I want you to do this Passover every year, 1 lamb per family. So even like a conservative estimate would be there were 200,000 families that were leaving Egypt. And God said, I want you to kill 1 lamb per family for the next 1,400 years. So the institution of the Passover is like bloodier than the ending of a Tarantino movie. Like, not that I've ever seen one, but from what I've read. And what you see here is you see this perpetual picture of the need for Christ. It says in the New Testament that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness for sins. And so the Jewish people were, for 1,400 years, each year celebrating a holiday that was solely focused on what they didn't yet have, which is Jesus Christ the Lord, the Son of the living God. And then we move into the next section, which is the journey to Mount Sinai. And so they leave, they're following a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. They get to the Red Sea, and the people of Israel are like, oh my gosh, like, what on earth? Can we go back to Egypt? Like, what have you done, Moses? They were letting us eat onions in Egypt is like one thing they say at one point, which is hilarious because that sounds awful. And they get to the Red Sea, and before, when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, he was like, hey, pick up your staff. You're going to do miracles with that staff. And Moses still has the staff. And he's standing at the Red Sea, and he says to the people, fear not, behold the salvation of the Lord. For the Egyptians that you see, because the Pharaoh changed his mind, and he's chasing after him. Moses says, the Egyptians that you see right now, you will never see again. God will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. It's a beautiful picture. Moses parts the Red Sea. They go through the Red Sea. It's this incredible shot from the movie The Prince of Egypt, which is so great, and I love it. And then they get through, the Red Sea collapses on the Egyptians who like rode their stupid chariots into like the muddy like sea floor. And it's just like, how dumb are you? Like, yeah, these like wooden chariot wheels, these iron chariot wheels, these are gonna do great on land that's been covered by water for all of human history. This is gonna be great. I bet it'll dry out really fast. But it does dry out because they walk on dry land, but then their wheels still get stuck. Anyways, then they get to the other side. Moses sings a song. It's totally lit. His sister grabs a tambourine and starts dancing. It's incredible. And then they continue. God continues to do miracles with them. He makes bitter water taste good. He sends sweet bread from heaven, which is called manna, which is another idea that the New Testament repeatedly uses. And God says, only grab the manna on 6 days of the week. Moses builds an altar and calls it, the Lord is my banner. Jehovah Nisi, the Lord is my banner. And Moses continues to learn and grow as a leader in this section. We see Moses' father-in-law kind of help him out here. That is the end of the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is completely different from the first half. The first half is only narrative. The second half is almost exclusively law and building stuff. It's like blueprints, laws, all of this jazz. So it totally changes. The first half is about their escape, their exit. The second half is about their establishment. The first half is primarily stories. The second half is primarily statutes. The first half is about Israel's freedom from slavery. The second half is about how to live in that freedom. And so that's what we're gonna see now. We move into the second half and we see Moses go to Mount Sinai, and there's all these incredible parts of this story. First of all is that God tells Moses that he wants the people of Israel to be a nation of priests, not a nation with priests, a nation of priests. And this brings up the most important idea of understanding the law in the Pentateuch that I can teach you, which is that God didn't want there to be laws. The reason there's laws is because they keep screwing up. So when you look at the stories, every single time in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, you get to a section with law, it comes right after a narrative where they break the thing that God is about to institute. God didn't bring the people out of Egypt to bring them into the wilderness for 40 years to give them 613 laws. That was not what God wanted to do. God did that because of the decisions of the people of Israel. And God is not deterministic, meaning God does not decide for his people what we will do. And if you believe God is deterministic, it will be really hard for you to understand the concept that I'm saying right now. So you start to see, wow, God didn't want there to be these laws. God wanted a nation of priests. In fact, it says in the Hebrew, when they get to Mount Sinai, it says, hey, Moses, call them up the mountain. In English, it says up to the mountain. But my professor in college taught me that the Hebrew actually says up the mountain. God wanted all of the people to encounter him face to face and become this nation of Moseses. And instead, they became a nation of complainers. And so that is a key to understanding the book of Exodus, especially the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. It's like at my house, we have a bunch of rules that I don't want to be rules. You're not allowed to play video games during the week at my house. Why is that? Because that's a good thing? No, because of a bunch of fights that happened and a bunch of possessiveness that happened over these video game systems and all this stuff. We also, at one point, had a rule that you weren't allowed to touch the back door. That's not a good rule. I don't want that rule. I'm just doing the best I can with what I've got to offer. I'm trying the best I can to keep my kids in order and to train them in the way of Jesus and help them grow up in a good way. There were so many problems with this door that we had to institute this stupid rule. Just don't touch the door. Do you know what I mean? I was at the park last week and somebody had broken a glass bottle on the ground, and I said, okay, kids, no one's allowed to touch this. The first thing my son Julian did is walk up to it and put his face down like an inch away from it. And I was like, okay, don't do that either, okay? And he's like, why? You said don't touch it. I'm like, yeah, This is what happened in the book of Leviticus, son. We don't want these rules. We don't want this to be the way that it is. That's why it is the way that it is. And so when you read these narratives, don't read it like God was always wanted to do this. That is not what God wanted to do. God wanted a nation of priests on the top of the mountain. He wanted to talk to them from the pillar of cloud face to face. So anyways, they won't do it. It's crazy. Moses goes up the mountain. God comes down in a pillar of black smoke. The Bible says that the smoke went up out of a kiln. There was a trumpet sound that reverberated from the smoke and grew louder and louder. Moses and Aaron entered the smoke, and eventually the people were forbidden from doing so. God gives 10 commandments, and no other gods before me, no idols, no taking God's name in vain, which does not mean saying, oh my God. It means stamping the name of Jesus or Yahweh on your preference and then saying that's what it means. Keeping the Sabbath day holy, honoring your parents, don't commit adultery, murder, steal, or bear false witness, and don't covet. These are the 10 commandments, but it's intriguing. There's actually multiple narratives of commandments in this book because these commandments don't last. If you know the story, they come down off of the mountain. There's a bunch of other laws too. There's laws about murder, slavery, parents, theft, neighbors, marriage, acceptable sexuality, money lending, witnesses, trials, land resting, feasts, governance of the land promised to Abraham. And in the next part, Moses goes up on the top of the mountain with the 70 elders of Israel, which all these numbers all tie into Jesus. Like you see 12 sons of Jacob, you see 12 disciples, you see 70 key followers of Jesus, you see 70 leaders of Israel, and they all go up at the top of the mountain, and it says this crazy thing. It's like my favorite thing. I never noticed it before until a couple of years ago, but it says that Moses talked to God face to face, but Moses has never seen God's face. So Moses is standing there, and God is standing there and covered in a pillar of cloud. So Moses is literally standing face to face with God, but he cannot see God's face through the smoke. But it says that one of the elders looked at the ground underneath God's feet at the bottom of the pillar of cloud, and the feet of God paved the top of Mount Sinai blue like a sapphire. So somehow I read that and I was like, that is the coolest thing I think that I have ever read. And Moses and Joshua end up staying at the top of the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And we're gonna get to the reason why he comes down in a minute. But what we see next is we see God giving the instructions for the Ark of the Covenant. And I've brought my Ark of the Covenant toy here with me today. And I'm touching it, but I'm not gonna die because it's not the real Ark of the Covenant. And my face is not gonna melt off like in Indiana Jones, hopefully. And so God gave them instructions for this. This is like a holy relic. And we're gonna get more into the Ark of the Covenant when we do Leviticus next week, but the general idea was that it would be like a relic holder, a holy relic holder for the people of Israel. And in it, they were supposed to put these things, and this toy is so lit that it has them in there. They're supposed to put the tablets of the 10 commandments, which Moses is about to destroy. So then they put the tablets of the second 10 commandments. And then they're supposed to put in there some manna, which is kind of like this like miracle because of course it wouldn't be able to last, you know, like if food lasts that long, it's not made of food. Do you know what I mean? Like, have you seen that news story where this guy in the 7-Eleven dropped a Twinkie behind a counter in like 1976, and then a guy found it, and he claims that it popped back into the original shape, which is just a great piece of content. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it sounds true, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound like maybe that could have happened? And then the third thing that's in there is Aaron's staff, which buds with almond blossoms on it, which is one of my favorite things from the Old Testament. And we're gonna talk about that more when we talk about Jeremiah, because that's an idea that comes back from Jeremiah. We see this idea in Exodus 25, which is a key idea that Hebrews illustrates for us. In Exodus 25, it says, these things, the ark, we're about to talk about the tabernacle. He says, these things are a pattern from above. What does that mean? It means that God is giving them blueprints to design things because God wants earth to mirror the heavenly throne room of God. That's what that means. That's why God wanted it that way. That's why the tabernacle looks like this, and the temple looks like the tabernacle, and the city of heaven looks like the Holy of Holies from the tabernacle. All of that stuff, it's all on purpose. It says in Hebrews 9:23, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things. It's really intriguing, especially when you get to the fact that the Ark of the Covenant is eventually going to have a priest dropping 7 drops of blood right here in the center of it. And he's going to be putting a sensor behind it so that the smoke covers this so that he can't see it. This is in the Holy of Holies, which is over here. And this actually looks exactly like what the place was that Jesus rose from the dead from, because he was laying there, and it says that there were 2 angels there. It doesn't say where they were, but I imagine that the angels inside of the tomb where Jesus was were posed like this when the people went inside. And so after that, we see the blueprints for the tabernacle. This is my tabernacle toy, and anyone can look at it afterwards who wants to. It's amazing. It's got the lampstand. It's got the lamb. This poor guy, he's got no idea. It's got everything. They thought of everything, guys. I know what you're thinking. When and where can I get one of these? You can get one on Amazon because it's so amazing. Now, my kids do play with this when they're sitting in my office. And I feel like in the future, they're gonna be at a therapist and they're gonna be saying, my dad made me play with Bible toys. That's not true. This is for me. They are allowed to utilize it, but if they ever say that to you when they're adults, that's not true. That's not true. I did not make them play with it. So anyways, God gives the blueprints for the tabernacle here, and then the narrative breaks in a really interesting way. And so I've already covered this, so I'll just go through this really quickly, which is that God wanted them to be a nation of priests, and the laws were added because of sin. So I already actually communicated that, so that's great, so we can move on. So then what happens is that in chapters 32 through 34, the law part breaks for the narrative of the golden calf. So all of a sudden, God gets Moses' attention. He's like, you should probably go back down there, because Moses is at the top. And then you see why all of the laws were being communicated the way they were being communicated, because almost all of them are just seem like direct responses to what the people of Israel were doing, which is they were worshiping the way that they worshiped in Egypt. And so they had taken all of their gold, they had convinced Aaron to help them. They made this golden calf, which is one of the gods that we were talking about before. There's a ton of amazing artwork, in history about some of this stuff. Aaron tells the most beta male version of the story to Moses of all time. Aaron is like, hey, Moses, they told me to do it. I threw the gold in the fire, quote, and out came this calf, end quote. Yeah, that's a believable story, Aaron. That happens a lot when I drop molten metal into a furnace. It comes out in the perfect shape of a previous god that was worshipped. So anyways, Moses breaks the tablets. He makes the people drink it. It's an absolute disaster. There's this moment where he calls everyone and says, who's on the Lord's side? It's absolutely crazy. I think that Mount Sinai is this mountain in Saudi Arabia. It's called Mount Jabal al-Lawz, and it looks like this. And for a long time, you could only get a really grainy picture of it because it was off limits. But in, I think, 2017 or 2018, the government of that country allowed people to go to this mountain. Some people don't think it's this mountain. I do. Some people do. The reason I think it's this mountain is because people who've climbed it, A, the whole top is black, like the fire of God came down on it, and B, because people who've climbed it have those rocks and they say it just doesn't match, it doesn't make sense, right? And then the second reason I believe that Mount Jabal al-Lawz is Mount Sinai is because this is sitting at the base of Mount Jabal al-Lawz, which looks like the rock that Moses struck. That's not going to happen until later in the text, but it's right there, sitting there. And I've seen people online with Instagram lives that are there, and they're touching the rocks that are below it, and the rocks are all smooth, like rushing water went over them. And so I just thought that was pretty interesting, and you guys would enjoy that. So then after that, it moves back into the law, but now instead of it being law, it is building narratives. So what we see God say that he has given this one guy and other people a spirit of skill. And they're gonna be putting all this stuff together. Why did God do it like this? Because God chose to leave them in the wilderness because of their sin to prepare them for the promised land. This is exactly what the future temple is going to look like proportionally, not size-wise. And so that's why. And it's got all this cool stuff in it, and everything in it is a picture of something. The last two chapters of Revelation show kind of like a garden-like thing, and it is a mirror of the first two chapters of Genesis. And the golden lampstand that is in here is I believe, a picture of the tree of life. 7 is the number of completeness. There's all this cool stuff in here. There's the table of showbread that David broke in and ate when he was hungry. And there is a bunch of really cool stuff in here. All of it is a picture of something very specific, and tons of great theologians have written about that. God also tells the priests what he wants them to wear. He tells them they're fit. So, hey, I want you guys to be totally, what do the Gen Z kids say? This is your drip? Is that what they say? Man, that sounds awful. Oh, man. Millennial lingo is so much better. And so then there's this website called Free Bible Images. They're so cool. And so there's like a ton of these. This is the way that God organized all of the people of Israel around the tabernacle. And we're going to show these pictures again next week, because this specifically is the setting for the entire book of Leviticus, is right here in this setting. These are the 12 sons of Jacob, kind of, because Joseph ends up having, there isn't one called Joseph, but 2 of his sons get to have one. And one of the 12 from Jacob was a woman. And so it's effectively the 12 sons in that way. And so this is what we see here. And then the end of the book, which is absolutely incredible, is the glory of God. The glory of God comes down from heaven into the tabernacle. It says, verse 34 of chapter 40, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The entire story of the Bible is God taking further and further and further measures to be with his people. And this is one of the big ones. You know, it's like the Garden of Eden. God's walking in the garden in the cool of the day saying, where are you, to the people, to Adam and Eve. Then we have this. God is dwelling in the tabernacle. And it's really, really incredible. We see the same thing in the temple narrative. When the temple is finished, we see God dwell in the temple. And this really harkens back to one of the conversations that Moses had with God in the book of Exodus. Earlier in the book, he's saying to God, like, I don't know what to do. These people are a disaster. And God says, well, then he's like, I'll just get rid of all of them and we'll start again. It's like Adam, Noah, Moses. We'll start again with you and Zipporah. And Moses says, please, please, please don't do that. And then Moses says to God, when we go to the promised land, if you will not go with us, I don't want to go. Because Moses understands something that I don't know if every Christian understands. The value proposition of being a person of faith is the presence of God. That's the thing that we offer. We don't offer morality for morality's sake, or even groups of fun people or connections or anything like that. The thing that we have to offer is the presence of God. That's what matters. That's what I'm thinking about every time I drive on this property, and every time I come to church, and every time I come to Bible study. I'm like, how can I help facilitate people encountering the living God? And Moses understood this. He said, if you won't go up with me, then I just don't want to do it. he says, quote, "Is it not in your going with us that we are distinct as a people?" Is the fact that we are Yahweh's people the only thing about us that makes us great? And he's right. He's right. That's the truth. And I think it's the truth. I believe it is the truth for us as well. There's a ton of amazing New Testament truths about Exodus. I would encourage you to look at those. You could type law or Moses into a Bible app, and then you just read everything the New Testament has to say about the book of Exodus. There's a lot of New Testament illumination over some of these things. And I brought out my Bible wall so that hopefully we could have an understanding of where we are going. So up here is the shelf that contains the 6 parts of Scripture. This is the law, the Pentateuch, and we've looked at Genesis and Exodus, and then it goes all through the rest. And then I have these icons that show the covenants, because the covenants are the best way to understand what is going on in the Bible. And so I'm not gonna do the one that is the Mosaic covenant yet, because we're gonna save that one for when we do Deuteronomy. But what we see is we see these iconic covenantal moments. The covenant with Adam, which I have this pow sign, which is from Genesis 3:15. The seed of Eve will crush the serpent's head. And then we have the covenant with Moses, Noah, won't flood the earth again. And then we have the covenant with Abraham, which is the key of the ones in Genesis. They're all important, obviously, but this one is the key. God says to you, it's a seed, I'm gonna make you into a land and a people group. And then we see the covenant with Moses and David are the other big ones. And then the one prophesied about Jeremiah are the other big ones. And all of these things are pointing to Jesus. If when we're studying the Bible, we're not knowing Jesus better as a result, then we are like the Pharisees, not like the Philippians. And so when we're studying this, it's not just to know things, it is to know him. Whom to know is life eternal, the Son of the living God. And so that is the book of Exodus. And I have a couple more memes for you. And why don't we take some questions? So we'll take some questions from the room. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And we'll take some questions from the chat, from the online chat. So this one on the left is the clown meme. It's one of my favorite memes I've ever made. I'm so happy with it. Are you guys familiar with the clown meme template? Effectively, it's getting worse, and the person who's saying these things is becoming a clown. That's the general idea. The top is, Song of Solomon is only about Jesus and the church. Anyone who read it is like, good Lord, I hope it's not about Jesus, because I'm feeling all sorts of ways reading this. The second one is, Jonah is a myth, but also true. I was reading one time this article where this guy was like, dude, like Jonah's a myth because I don't have a corresponding view of truth and reality. He's like, so truth does not have to correspond to reality. And I was just like, you are the worst person who has ever lived. That is probably the worst thing. That is the most intellectually dishonest thing I've ever heard. I'm sure you live that way in your life. I'm sure when someone punches you in the face, you're like, I didn't feel that, because truth does not correspond with reality. Anyways, the next one is Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and the last one is the parts of the Bible I don't like are not inspired. So that's the joke. And then the other joke is that's my son Ezra. And he came up to me one time and said, I always wondered what Moses' last name was. What if he's related to us? And I thought, that's a good joke. That's a good joke. Okay, let's see. If you have a question in the room, you can raise your hand. And Blake will walk over to you. And we'll see if we have any questions from online. Watching from Boston, let's go. Boston. Hey from Prescott, love it. Watching from Arkansas, watching from Oregon, watching from Florida. America's basement, watching from Nevada, praise the Lord, amen. Watching from Ohio, watching from Michigan. Frogs are nasty. I agree. Yeah. Have you ever eaten like a gummy frog or something? You're like, why is it in the shape of something that's disgusting? I just don't understand that. Listening from my car, heading home from work, love it. Whoever's in the sound booth needs to get a raise for the sound quality. The guitar was so satisfying. So that's great. Michael, you can write that down. Congratulations, you champion. All right. Does anybody have a question about anything from Exodus in the room? If you're watching online, you can toss a question in. It's always hard because the second we finish every week, there's like 5 questions in the chat that they wait until we're finished to post. Does anybody have a question? If not, that's totally fine. We can move on to, here's one right here. If not, we can move on to our groups. Hello, what's your name?
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Do you have a reference for when Moses met God face to face and you said the pillar of clouds and the sapphire on the mountain?
For which part? The specific part?
Yes.
Yes. Let me grab that for you. Uh, 24:10. Exodus 24:10 is where that one is.
Thank you.
That was it? That was an easy one. Okay, we've got one up here in the front, Blake. Could you put your hand up again so he can see you? Yes.
Would you talk a little more about Genesis 24:11? God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank. You know, I mean, when the ark was looking like it was going to fall and someone reached out to steady it, he was struck dead. How is it that these 70 saw God, ate and drank, and he didn't? You know, I thought he told Moses, don't even have them come to the foot of the mountain.
So is your question, why do the 70 that go up to the top of the mountain not die, and the person who steadies the ark, why did they die later in the text? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the 70 didn't die because they didn't see God. No one can see God and live. They saw a pillar of cloud that God was standing in, that his entire figure and face were covered. One of the parts I didn't get to talk about is when Moses said he wants to see God, and God says, no. He said, but you can stand in the cleft of the rock and I will walk by and you can see my after glory, is effectively what's being said. And so Moses basically is allowed to look after God walked past to see the remaining glory tail that is coming off of him. And so, and interestingly enough, that spot where Moses was when that story is exactly where Elijah travels to go to after the problem on the top of that mountain where he wins that battle and he thinks Jezebel is still going to kill him. So it's a pretty interesting thing. Why did they not die? Because they didn't see the face of God. Why did the person die who steadied the ark? Because God is incredibly specific about the way that he wants us to worship him. And that's not even the most intense death in the Pentateuch. That's the one that comes in the middle of Leviticus when it says they offered strange fire to God, which textually I think means that they were drunk when they were offering that sacrifice to God. But I'll explain that all next week. And did that help? Great. Okay, we got a couple from the internets and then we'll go to group. Why did Moses not get to go to the promised land? Because God told him to strike a rock and have water come out, and he did. And then God told him to speak to the rock, and he struck it because he was performing. And God said, nah, that's it. And this type of stuff, I think, is difficult for us to understand sometimes because it seems like maybe rash or like intense. And I think it's really important that when we're reading the Bible, we allow God to shape the reality of what is good and not our own instincts. And so we bend the way that we see the world to the way that God sees the world, not the inverse of that. And God doesn't always say exactly why he does things in the Bible. So that's another important thing to understand. It's not like it says every single reason why. Yeah, thanks for the question, Amanda. It says that someone's question got put into a different folder. I don't know what that means. I've been using the internet for a long time, and I genuinely have no idea what that means. Well, we have some questions for groups. I want to thank everybody for watching. Oh, I made another Exodus meme. This is Miriam looking at the Red Sea with a tambourine in her hand. And so here are some questions for your guys' tables. If you don't have a table, you can come forward and I'll find a table for you, or you can just go find a seat. If you're watching online and you want to start a group of people each Tuesday, I think that would be great. And we'll see you guys next week for Leviticus.